this this particular event is meant to draw on various resources in our community to share both the experience of veterans, current and past. And um, many of the portions of this were pre-recorded in order to make sure that I could capture as many different people as I could from across the country. And I also was able to get a little bit of footage. One of our members, Mr. Joe Segal, is the last living member of the Calgary Highlanders unit that liberated Holland. And Global TV did a number of interviews with him, of which I was able to find a few, or actually I have to thank Ken Miller for sending me the links to them, which are off YouTube. But the beginning of this is actually takes us to the lobby of our synagogue, which has a very particular feature that is very, very consistent with Remembrance Day. And so I'm going to just warn you that because there are several different videos on different platforms, I'm going to be moving back and forth between certain screen shares. So I apologize in advance for that, but it was really the only way that I was able to put all of this together. So with your permission, here's our first segment. As many of you know, I'm a newcomer to Canada. Some 18 years ago, my family and I arrived here in Vancouver. And my first encounter with the veterans community was probably on Rosh Hashanah, or between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, when the Canadian Legion would gather at the monument at the Shaare Zedek Cemetery to remember the war veterans and the fallen heroes of Canada's wars. But it must have been one Remembrance Day, or perhaps a Shabbat just before, where I had neglected to remember or to recognize the event, when maybe it was Oscar Dernfeld, or perhaps another veteran, who came up to me and said to me, "Rabbi, you know, it's really important." And as someone who grew up in the United States, we had Veterans Day, but I don't think Veterans Day quite has the special significance that Remembrance Day does here. And I think, especially as we move to the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Europe, that the presence of these individuals, physically of course, is dwindling, but their presence and their contribution to our community is certainly something that we appreciate less. And I'm here in this very spot just to call your attention to the fact that here we have a plaque that reads, "In honor of those men and women of the Jewish community who served their king and country in both world wars, this house of worship is respectfully dedicated." And when they built the Shaare Zedek building in 1948, the group that they wanted to honor and recognize were the veterans, were those who had served in World War II and in World War I. I want to bring a little color to that. I want to bring a little bit of detail. So, in D-Day, Canadians stormed Juno Beach. There were about 14,000 soldiers. Canada represented about 10% of the overall forces that stormed Normandy on that morning. Overall, there were 17,000 men and women from this tiny nation of a community of only 170,000 Jews. 17,000 out of 170,000 Jews fought in the ranks of Canada's military in World War II. Some of those individuals are individuals in our community. And I'm going to be sharing a little bit of Joe Segal's story. I was particularly motivated to do this year because Joe told me that he understood that he was the last surviving member of his unit of the Calgary Highlanders who liberated Holland. And so if we don't capture these stories now, we're likely to completely miss the opportunity. Jewish soldiers felt a particular obligation to enlist and to serve. In fact, it's recorded that Ben Dukelman, who was someone who rose to the rank of major in the Queen's Own Rifles and also stormed the beaches at Normandy, said the following: "It's quite clear to me that as a loyal Canadian, it was my duty to volunteer to fight. Besides, as a Jew, I had a special score to settle with the Nazis." That phrase is itself very interesting. In Canada, there was a conscription act, and you could volunteer or you could be drafted. Only volunteers would be sent overseas. And in fact, the soldiers themselves had an interesting term for those who didn't volunteer, those who were conscripted. They were known as zombies because essentially they weren't going to fight overseas in Europe. But the Jews knew that they had a special mission. And in fact, there was occasionally voiced in a mess hall, in an officer's tent, that this war was a war fought on behalf of the Jews. Now, we may know that there are many and complex reasons for Canada's involvement in the war, for the United States' involvement in the war. Perhaps they were inspired by Churchill. Perhaps it was Pearl Harbor. Perhaps it was finally the recognition that the Nazi menace was in fact threatening the entire world. But whatever the real reason, whatever the political calculus, Jews knew that they had a special role to play. And they also, even within the ranks of Canada's military, encountered a little bit of anti-Semitism. In fact, Joe Segal told me about specific moments where he himself heard people say that we're fighting a Jewish war. And so when Ben Dukelman says, "It was clear to me that it was my duty as a loyal Canadian," but then also said he had a score to settle with the Nazis, it means that Jews understood that there was something important going on there. There were also Jews who had distinguished service in the European theater of war. For example, Samuel Moses, known as Mo Hurwitz, who received the Distinguished Service Medal. On August 4th, 1944, his armored division, missing one of its tanks, was given the task of opening up a flank in the Nazi lines. They had to dismount their Sherman tanks. They didn't have infantry support, and almost in a movie-like outcome, after a German tank exploded and Mo Hurwitz was trapped under a burning tree, he managed to get himself out, managed to pick up a Bren machine gun, and then managed to capture 31 German soldiers together with 15 other of his Canadian comrades. They opened up a kilometer-wide breach in the German line, which ultimately allowed for the advancement of the Canadian forces and also allowed for the capture of Falsey Road. Unfortunately, Mo Hurwitz, 3 months later, on October 28th, was pinned down on a narrow road in a mountain pass where his His tank was ultimately eliminated by the Germans, and all of the members of his crew became casualties. In the coming moments, we're going to share with you a couple of different snippets. What really we tried to do was to reach every live speaking person that we could within our reach, who are either serving in the Canadian military, as a chaplain, as a doctor, and I also had the privilege to speak with Joe Segal about his military service. We're also going to be sharing with you a small clip from Global TV's Liberation documentary, which will air this coming Sunday. And we have a short video from Joe Segal and his own testimony of what he witnessed in Holland. Dr. Andrea Tuka is going to teach us something very interesting about the idea of moral injury and the way in which Canadian soldiers manage post-traumatic stress, specifically with respect to the way in which moral conflicts impact their mental health. I'm also going to be able to share with you my conversation with Mordechai Rothman, who is a rabbi in Toronto who serves as, believe it or not, a padre, which in our language is a chaplain in the Canadian military. And he speaks about how he brings Jewish values into his work as a chaplain within the Canadian military. But allow me to share with you just a few highlights from my conversation with Joe Segal about his military service. Joe, as I mentioned, served with the Calgary Highlanders, and he was a couple months behind D-Day. And he speaks to me about understanding that when he arrived in Belgium, he understood the gravity of what he was doing because he saw there were Jews there as he arrived in the towns that they liberated. He could see them wearing the Star of David. And he speaks about the fact that 18-year-olds are not really prepared for this. When they sign up, when they volunteer, it's almost impossible for them to know what they're getting into. He shared also that the trauma for him was largely environmental, that you could see a soldier slumped over in a wheelchair, a fallen German soldier who was just left, no one to bury him. And some of these images are images that you never forget, and they're part of the background of the service and the environment that these soldiers have to endure. Joe also told me, you just advanced until they fired on you. You were sort of the bait that would force the German forces to fire at you, almost like they were being used as cannon fodder, although I'm sure that it was more disciplined than that, and I'm sure that it was done with more care than that. But Joe said, you advanced until they fired on you, and then that's how you knew where they were, and you returned fire, and you took a new position, and you moved forward. Interestingly, Joe told me that after they had liberated Holland, after they finished their duties, they were given the following choice. You could either enlist in the new 6th Division and go and fight in Japan, or you could stay as part of the occupation force in Germany. And Joe told me he stayed in Germany. What he saw in Germany was firsthand how the Germans were in denial about what had happened, that they pretended that they didn't know anything, that they too were victims of war and victims of a propaganda machine. But he also told me that you can't really appreciate what the joy is of liberation. To see people in true elation once the Canadians and the Allied forces arrived to liberate various villages and towns. He said there were children of 6 or 7 who had never lived not under the occupying force of the Nazis. What Joe's story reminded me was that the world, Canada, had to rely on 18-year-olds, on young men who would volunteer for combat. Not who were conscripted into combat, but volunteered for combat. Couldn't really possibly appreciate what they were doing. And at the same time, it was those soldiers who ensured that the greatest threat to civilization that occurred in living memory was foiled and was snuffed out. It is they who ended the greatest force of anti-Semitism ever known to man. It's interesting though, Joe reflected and said, we thought we would wipe it out, but unfortunately we see it rearing its ugly head again and again. But I'll say one thing from my conversation with Joe, is that the conversation ultimately drifted to the question of giving back to your world, giving back to society. And that there was an understanding that serving in Canada's military was a way to give, but it also seems to me to have inspired him to feel like it was important to continue to be part of the effort to create a better society here in Vancouver, in Canada, and the world. And Joe laments the fact that he feels that our community, the Jewish community, is not as involved as it could be in improving the city as a whole in its major charities. With that said, I think when we look at the record of Canadian service, we can see how these individuals were inspired by their service to Canada, by the sacrifice that they made. They didn't think that it ended in 1945. In many ways, I understand from Joe that he understands that that's where it began. And he was inspired by his service. I think we too should be inspired by that service. We too should remember what these soldiers gave, what these soldiers did, and how they were part of an effort as Canadians to give to the world and to promote Canada's reputation and ethical standing. I just also want to note that the one other feature that we're going to see tonight is going to be a slideshow of the few photos of Canadian soldiers, Canadian Jewish soldiers from Vancouver who perished in the war. Chose that set particularly, some 9 photos, because it would be impossible to show you all, but the ones from Vancouver seem to have a particularly good relevance to represent the greater whole for all of us. And so you will see that tonight. I thank you for being part of this Remembrance Day activity. Okay, so now I want to share with you specifically the the features from Global Video about from Joe Segal's interviews. So sharing again, and
we came into a that was called Dotenham, and we came into the town, and it was natural for all the people to come out to appreciate the freedom that they were about to get. But it was the worst thing in the world because the Germans had just pulled out and they took their 105 with them and they had everything zeroed in. Then they started to shell. And when you start shelling, the obvious place to go is underground. So where the hell do you head for? You head for the basement. And I had a buddy that I went through basic training with him. And his name was Brown, and he was from Lloydminster, Alberta. And he was 6 foot. I was a little guy, like 5'7", 8. And he tried to get into the basement, but he couldn't get in. It was full of civilians and some troops, and he stood on the staircase because he couldn't get in, and he got shrapnel through the head.
I think he did.
Okay, hold on. We're gonna.
Now, why are we here? We don't want to be here.
Here we go.
It's the Netherlands that is still appreciative and conscious of the liberation. And the Canadians had a big part to play in that. I've had a great life. I've had wonderful experiences. But I have never forgotten what it is like. I learned, I grew up because of my war service. And I never forgot to understand the responsibility that you inherit with that kind of experience.
So I want to just reflect on that a little bit. I think really what I hear from Joe is this very important idea that that experience really shaped him. It helped him to understand a sense of duty, a sense of giving back to other people, and obviously it's animated him in our community for 75 years. I want to just now bring up for you just a couple of other interesting items that come out of both the archives and of a much longer Jewish tradition of serving in the military of various countries. So here on this slide, what you see is first a text. I won't read for you the whole text, but I'll just summarize it. It's from the Chavetz Chaim. Chavetz Chaim is Rabbi Yisrael Meir Kaganoff, who's probably one of the single greatest rabbis of Europe at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. He is a standard text for halachic work. His work, the Mishnah Berurah, is studied in almost every single yeshiva on a daily basis. And what he writes, he has a pamphlet or a monograph that he wrote in 1881 called Machane Yisrael. Machane Yisrael means the camp of Israel. And it was written because there were so many Jews who were conscripted into the Russian army that he felt it was important to write a text so they understood what it meant to serve in the army and how best to preserve their Judaism. And in this particular paragraph, what he shares with us is that the people who serve in the army have to, in a sense, put their Judaism to a great test. And those who succeed in preserving their Judaism in that test, they have tremendous reward. That the spiritual gain in that is profound, and that when God looks at that, he sees a remarkable achievement, an achievement that he compares to Abraham's tests, the story tests of Abraham that are found in the first chapters of the book of Bereshit. And I thought that was a very important piece to just highlight that the Chavetz Chaim felt that sometimes conscription into the army is non-negotiable. It's something you have to do, but at the same time, those who survive it do so with great reward. And so here, and again, I thank Nancy for pointing out these, Nancy Putterman, who found some of these archives for me. If you'll see here, this is a picture of the Servicemen's Passover Seder in 1944. And here, this is a Servicemen's Seder in Halifax. In Halifax was probably a staging area for many departures, and the Halifax community was very supportive of Jewish servicemen. Bring things to BC, you see a picture of the Servicemen's Seder in Prince Rupert. I know it says 1940 question mark, and that's because the archives aren't sure exactly which year this is from, but you can see that servicemen's seders took place coast to coast. You can also see that the Canadian Armed Forces actually took care to print a Jewish calendar, so that the members of the military were able to follow Judaism. Kosher food was actually hard to come by, and the community in Halifax tried to support as much as possible, but probably in the theater of war itself, it was really very difficult to do so. But there is a very practical side to religion within the Canadian military. And the truth of the matter is, I would have been ignorant to this if it were not for my conversation with our next guest, Dr. Andrea Tuka. Dr. Andrea Tuka is really a very special woman. She is the director of mental health services for the Pacific Division of Canadian Forces. She herself is an immigrant from Hungary, and she actually spoke beautifully last year. We could not record it because it was Shabbat, but she spoke absolutely beautifully about servicemen and what calls them to service, and her experience in the military for us last Remembrance Day. And I should blame Andrea for putting the bug in my head to ensure that we had something special for this year. And so I'm really glad that she also chose to give me some time and present an interview to me as well. And so now I'm going to share first a couple of introductory statements by Andrea, and then the balance of our discussion together. I just want to say that in this little clip, she will say good morning. That's because we had to record it a little bit earlier, but she's aware that this is being broadcast at night. And I thank her for giving me so much time.
Good morning, Rabbi, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to greet you and the members of the congregation on the occasion of Remembrance Day. Special greetings to Mr. Segal and Rabbi Rothman. On Remembrance Day, as a military psychiatrist in the context of spirituality and religion, my personal reflection include a sad reality that many of our soldiers and veterans continue to suffer, not just physically, but also psychologically. One of the reasons soldiers suffer is moral injury. Moral injury is a term proposed to describe the distress that individuals feel when they are exposed to traumatic events that violate their core ethical beliefs or deeply held values. These beliefs and values are often increasingly associated with religious or spiritual identity. Examples of moral injury in the military would be if a soldier is not able to intervene and protect helpless civilians due to the rules of engagement of the mission. Another example would be killing enemy combatants. As modern military missions become increasingly complex, it is now more common that soldiers have to make decisions in life and death situations under intense time pressure. The most common feelings associated with moral injury are guilt, shame, loss of identity, loss of meaning, and sense of betrayal. It is not easy to talk about those experiences and associated feelings, and it is difficult to treat them with the traditional clinical interventions. So many soldiers and veterans suffer for years or decades. Now research shows that a holistic treatment approach that integrates spiritual and religious principles and practices supports recovery. In particular, confession and forgiveness from a higher power, God, is noted to support self-forgiveness, which is identified as a critical component of recovery from moral injury and reconstruction of meaning and purpose. Military mental health chaplains and religious leaders, rabbis, have an integral role in helping soldiers heal from the consequences of moral injury. I also see myself encouraging soldiers and veterans to connect or reconnect with religious and spiritual resources. I can see a parallel between spirituality, religion, and military service. First, serving in the military requires one to be fit. Fitness has many components: physical, emotional, social, spiritual, religious, complementing each other and needing to be continuously nurtured. The spiritual health that is, of course, centered to Judaism and other religions. Secondly, serving in the military is never an individual task. It is always a teamwork, whether in peace or in time of conflict. Moreover, the individual soldier doesn't just belong, but also integrates into a platoon, a company, and a battalion. When a soldier is sent to a new base to do a new job and live in a new community, or whether she is deployed overseas, the military is there to provide support at many levels. Here we can see an obvious parallel with a well-functioning congregation where each member is valued for his or her contribution, and new members or members in need are supported and warmly welcomed. Finally, military leaders share the larger vision, develop trust, ensure clear communication, and provide support to achieve unit cohesion, which is fundamental to accomplish a given mission in a meaningful way. Rabbis, too, have similar responsibilities to develop, lead, and support a congregation devoted to Judaism and its values. This Remembrance Day is different from the Remembrance Days in the past years. Many soldiers and veterans who struggle emotionally as a result of trauma or loss, the days and weeks leading to the Remembrance Day can be difficult and trigger painful memories. I wish that every soldier and veteran will find or already has the way to connect with comrades, family, and friends to receive support and mitigate the distress. I also hope that soldiers able to reflect on the positive experiences and achievements and able to draw strength from the sense of belonging and community.
Thank you, Andrea. That was really wonderful. Uh, if I understand correctly, what that essentially means is that Canada's military or military operations throughout the year, throughout the world, need Yom Kippur as much as they need anything else. That's sort of discovered the idea of having a sort of a day of atonement or a process of forgiveness is a really important thing.
Yes, absolutely.
Wow. Okay. So that's really very, very interesting. And I sort of I mean I think it brings a lot of very interesting things to the fore. Just I remember listening a couple years ago to an interview with a police officer somewhere in the United States, and I think was surrounding some of these issues of police interaction with persons of color or perhaps persons with mental illness, and this particular soldier said that when he was in Iraq or maybe Afghanistan, but he said we learned that there were many different ways that you would read body language, and there are different ways to disengage and disarm people, and we had to have a whole sort of spectrum of tools in order to disarm an enemy or get out of a dangerous situation, and that he was regretting that those same set of tools weren't being used in police action. I don't want to get political on this, but what
that says to me is that there is this image of the soldier as someone who just follows orders and extremely mechanical. And that was a window to me that really the job of being in the military um, actually requires a lot of nuance and um, a lot of forward thinking marshaling skills in many different areas. And I would just wonder if how you see soldiers handling the burden of being able to or being required to have all those different kinds of skills, and how does that exacerbate the moral injury concept, or how do those play into each other?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. As I just, said in my note about moral injury, it's really relevant into this modern warfare, which is so complex, and so many nuances, as you say. And actually, soldiers are participating in many levels in training about ethics. They learn about ethical dilemmas, they analyze ethical dilemmas, they practice different situations but they could potentially encounter during a mission, and they do exercises, physical and mental exercises, how they need to react in those situations. And it's exactly related to that, to to avoid avoid to be in situations or regret the actions in those situations.
Mm-hmm.
But as I said, that they get into those situations very commonly when they are very high stake. Life and death is the question, and they do not have much time to think. So
Mm-hmm.
they have to make decisions, and
Right.
they make a decisions what they think that is the best decision under the
Right.
circumstances,
And then they have to live with it.
and they have to live with that. Exactly, exactly.
Wow.
So
That's
it's
really
very, very, very difficult. And this modern warfare, especially the urban warfare, it's not like in the traditional ones. Then there is a commander, and the lower ranks are following the commander. It is many times lower ranks have to be the platoon leaders, and they get into situation when they are, the main leader, and they have to make decisions.
mm-hmm. Oh,
It can be
interesting.
very difficult, very difficult.
Interesting. Wow. We never knew that. I think, many of us in Vancouver, we're blessed with living very peaceful lives, and we don't really think about how soldiers have to engage in those kinds of issues. Just one other thing to just touch on, and I don't even know if Canada operates drones or whether um, we have soldiers who are managing the conflict of what I've heard is that it can be extremely destabilizing to be in that kind of position. I don't know if you have any insight or experience with that.
Yes, I do have. I had a couple of patients who actually were drone operators or had to analyze the aftermath of a drone attack. And yes, as you say, it is very disturbing to see that from a distance and feeling powerlessness. And also another aspect is that those individuals are at home, not necessarily on in a combat zone. So they experience that extremely disturbing, traumatic incident, and at the end of the day, they pack up and they just go home to their normal life. So that contrast, it's also very difficult to manage.
Right. Wow.
If I can suggest to you
Yeah.
an excellent movie about that, the Eye in the Sky,
Uh-huh.
it's really worth to watch. It's about
Okay.
a drone operator.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, that sounds really interesting. Well, Andrea, thank you so much. Really just so appreciate you as a resource in our community for sharing this whole window to this to the moral injury, and for making time and all the investment that you put into this. Is really very much appreciated. So why don't we start by, if you wouldn't mind, just telling me um, in what capacity do you serve in the Canadian Forces?
Sure. So my name is Mordechai Rothman, and I serve in the capacity of chaplain, or padre, as they call it in the Canadian Armed Forces. My role is generally to provide support and um, support, generally speaking, to on a very general level, to the troops in my particular unit, which is the Queen's York Rangers.
And how many Jewish soldiers do you end up ministering to? I don't know what the right word is, but
Well, so I'm actually assigned to a particular unit. In my unit, there's approximately 4 Jewish soldiers in my unit, but that's not my role to only provide support to the Jews in my unit. I provide um, essentially ministerial services to my unit in particular. I'm able to provide them with a lot of support around Jewish values and Jewish ideals, but it's definitely not just the Jewish people in my unit. It's everybody in my unit.
and so what I'm particularly interested in is how your Jewishness and your Canadian sense overlap. Like, what inspired you to serve in this capacity?
So I've been in the armed forces for about I want to say it's almost 5 years now. And when I first moved back to Toronto, I studied. I grew up in Toronto, and I studied at Yeshiva University, where I received my rabbinic ordination.
I see it behind you on the wall.
Yeah. And so I had been there for a number of years. And one of the things that they try to do at Yeshiva University is kind of give you different opportunities to see how you can serve in the rabbinate. You know, it's not only a traditional rabbi. You can be a teacher, you can run an organization like I do in my civilian life. And there's all kinds of different things that you're able to do. And I remember they brought in I want to say he was a 2-star general in the US Army, a rabbi. And this guy looked like he was living the dream. He flew back and forth on US military transports to the Middle East. So he would spend a lot of time in Israel. I think his family actually lived in Israel. And he was he was a chaplain in the United States Armed Forces. I moved back to Toronto, and I moved back under somewhat uncertain terms of work. I was starting at the organization that I currently run. I was the only employee at the time. It wasn't a sure thing. And my family, even though I moved to Canada when I was about 9 and became a Canadian citizen, my family all stems from the US, and we have a long military history. My grandfather served in the Navy. My other grandfather was a career soldier. Just a lot of people in the military. And I thought, you know what, I think it would be an interesting concept for me, just as kind of a fallback to apply to be in the Canadian Armed Forces. What I didn't realize at the time was it takes about a year, especially if you've been kind of all over the place, like a yeshiva student might be, like spend some time in Israel and the US. You come into the Canadian Armed Forces as a chaplain with rank, and that's rank of captain. And because you come in with captain, you have a certain amount of access to secret information and things of that nature. So they have to do a really thorough background check on you. And that, at the time that I was coming into the military, took about a year to complete all the background checks and everything that they did. especially because I had traveled quite a bit. I was in Israel, like I said. So I applied for the job, and about a year later, things were really going well at the organization that I was working for, Chai Lifeline, which I actually is how I actually originally met you. And I wasn't really interested anymore. But it does take them a year or so to people to get in. About 6 to 8 months later, I would say, they called me back and they said, we're having trouble getting, we want to be a little bit, more inclusive. We need more rabbis in the armed forces to support, to be pastoral care for the soldiers. And they said, would you consider joining, even though you told us you weren't necessarily interested, because it takes so long and you've done all the paperwork, maybe you would reconsider. And I said, you know what, I will do that. I'll reconsider. I'll give it a try. You actually have to apply for the role within a particular unit. So I had to go and interview for the role. I interviewed for the role and got along really well with at the time the commanding officer, and he was just so excited to have somebody who was Jewish come to the unit and bring those Jewish values and those ideals. I've been in ever since, and I have a very strong sense of being able to provide those Jewish values and those Jewish ideals to Canadian Armed Forces in a meaningful way. I think it's a great opportunity for Jewish Canadians to, feel proud that they're giving back in some way to the, we live in Canada, we have all these great freedoms and all these amazing opportunities. And I like that part of who we are as Jews, not just the serving aspect, like a Jew serving, but even the values that are being allowed to proliferate in Canada can then give back to the country in a very meaningful way.
Right. Now, I want to just drill down on something here. And you say you bring Jewish values to the unit. So give me like a window to, a moment in. Are you still Captain Rothman? Are you?
I'm Captain Rothman, yes.
And you are addressed as Padre or as Captain?
So generally speaking, unless it's a formal setting, they're going to address me as Padre, and that just comes Padre, obviously meaning father. I'm
picking up how awkward it is for a musmach of Yeshivas Rabbeinu Yitzchak Elchanan
yes,
to be called Padre. So I will refrain, and I will just call you Captain Rothman or Rabbi Rothman. Give me a window into a day in what of those moments might look like.
Well, first off, I'll say I do want to say that the soldiers call you Padre, and it's a term of endearment. They actually really, my job is to be there as a pastoral care to support the soldiers. They really care very deeply and about their Padre. They want that person to, I care about them very deeply as well, and it's a term of endearment. It does come from obviously the overall military doctrine is, people use that term Padre, and you're not used to using the term rabbi. Some people will on occasion use rabbi, but it is a term of endearment. That being said, to answer your question, I will generally spend once a week at the unit in the evening. I'll show up at about 7 o'clock. From 7 to 8 is called PT, where we'll work out, and I'll generally do a run, push up, basic, you can imagine what Army kind of physical activity is. Sometimes the soldiers will play hockey or just floor hockey or whatever, just something to get the blood flowing and do some exercise. And then I make a point of walking around. The unit's going to kind of break up into different sections. Some guys will do weapons training, some guys will do military theory, and they'll go into different classrooms in different areas. And I'll just make a point of walking around and making sure to be seen. I want the soldiers to know that I'm there, that there's somebody they can talk to. There's a certain sense, there's a certain attitude in the military. You've got to be strong. You can't be weak. So, speaking to a therapist or anybody like that is, I don't know if it's frowned upon, but it's not seen necessarily as tough. This is very colloquial. it's not anything official. But to speak to a man of God, that's okay. So oftentimes soldiers will come to me with, just regular family stuff. Hey, I got laid off at my job in the civilian life. I don't necessarily have money for, for holiday presents this year. I'm having trouble in my marriage. On occasion, I'll have some soldiers who are dealing with PTSD issues, and I'll make the proper referral. But if I can help them with some Jewish values, an example that I once gave to a soldier was the idea of the idea of a soulmate or a bashert. And it was a great idea that I actually heard from, I think it was in Michtav Milio, if I recall, where a certain gentleman was having trouble at home, with his spouse, and there was certain things that she was doing that was really getting under his skin, that she was just not so great with. And I just shared with him the basic idea of, your soulmate or your bashert, you're actually two halves of a whole. So if somebody is, let's say, really outgoing, and another person is really meek, and you see that they're not really working, so maybe God broke the soul, when he broke the soul in two and split it into man and woman, perhaps he gave, you 90% of the outgoingness, and he gave her 10%. It wasn't necessarily split evenly. But if you guys come together and work on something, it'll actually bring you closer together. And just hearing that kind of basic fundamental principle in Jewish marriage, he took that home, and for him that was a very defining and positive moment. So, and that was with obviously a complete somebody who's not involved in religion at all,
right?
But just needed some support and some idea of how to make his life a little bit better at home.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so it's a very typical rabbi kinds of stuff. Just you're the only rabbi that I know of who doesn't have a Jewish congregation.
Technically, I mean, there's a few of us.
There's a few of them, right? There's a few of them.
There's a few of us. We have there's one or two other in Toronto. There's another in Montreal. I think there's actually one out in Vancouver as well, from what I understand.
Oh, okay. Well, now I want to ask you a little bit about your family history, and if you could just speak a little bit about what ethic in particular brings so much military involvement in your family, regardless of which side of the border.
I think my grandfather was obviously in the Navy, during World War II. As a U.S. citizen, I think, and a strong Jew, he felt very, very passionate about joining up at that time, and obviously fighting the Germans and stuff. That was something that was very important to him. What they knew or what they didn't know, but he actually wasn't a very large person. He was kind of a small guy, so they put him on one of the boats. He was a radio operator, but that was his way of kind of giving back. On my mom's side, my grandfather was actually a career soldier who, after World War II, the United States had a very strong presence in Northern Africa, particularly Morocco. And he ended up, as a Jew in Morocco, going to the local synagogue and met, he's an Ashkenazic Jew from upstate New York, Syracuse, New York, and met my grandmother, and actually lived and married in Morocco for quite some time, and then was stationed during the Vietnam War in Japan. So my mom actually was born on a United States Air Force base in Japan, and while he was stationed overseas, he was essentially training the Vietnamese when the Americans were officially not training the Vietnamese. He was there training the Vietnamese. If you know the history of the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
So and I think that's a sense of duty, of appreciation as well. I didn't know him, and to be frank, my mom didn't really know him. He died when my mom was 3. But what I know of him was that he was the personality of a military man is generally speaking a man who wants to give back, who likes to abide by laws and rules and regulations, and from my understanding, that's the kind of guy he was.
Now, I want to shift a little bit just to a completely different area. And that's sort of, I guess, the subject heading is challenges. We hear news reports that Germany has a significant problem of resurgent neo-Nazis training in their military system. There have been news stories about individuals in the Coast Guard and people who have military training who are sort of entering parts of the white supremacist world. Are there any challenges that you think Jews face in terms of serving in the Canadian military? Is there uh, is there an encounter sometimes with people of the, on that far right ultra nationalist side of things, occasionally anti-Semitic, that Jewish soldiers might encounter, or is that something that's completely absent from the Canadian military?
I'm not going to say that something doesn't exist, I think is a very difficult thing. I can only tell you my experience, and my experience has been extremely positive. Um, I have, one of the main positive outcomes, I would say, of me being involved in the military is that I realized as a rabbi working in the Jewish community that I have a very, as much as I like to think I have a bubble, I really had a very, I lived outside a bubble. I really lived in a very small world of, I basically only knew people in the Jewish community. And what this was kind of really bring me out into getting to know people that I would never otherwise come in contact with. I mean, and having real meaningful relationships, police officers and people of that nature. And it's been a real incredible experience just hearing from them, hearing their point of views, then listening to my point of view. And it's always, there's questions and people might not understand, Rabbi, how come you can't come on Shabbat in the car? What if I drive you and stuff like that? But it's always coming from a place of like they really just want to ask the question. They want to understand, and
Right.
it's only been positive, and I only found really respectful people. In fact, I would say some of the most respectable, giving, kind individuals that I've come across are people in the military, and officers in the military are just really incredible human beings.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, and I guess just one last question is, have there been any special challenges over the past, I guess, 6-7 months in the military as a chaplain, given the pandemic?
I mean, I have struggled with, I'm not, we're certainly not able to be as present. So a lot of what our training has been, at least for myself, has been, through Zoom and things of that nature. So, that, so to speak, presence that I shared with you early on, that I tried to make a point of making sure that I'm walking around and very visual, very visible to the soldiers, so that I'm not, sitting in an office, and if somebody wants to come and see me, they can come and see me. No, I made a point of being out there.
Mm.
That's certainly a challenge, due to COVID. A lot of guys in my unit were very involved here in Ontario. There was the Armed Forces was called in to help in some of the nursing homes.
Mm.
So a lot of individuals from my unit were involved with that, and being able to help what some of those individuals saw and had to deal with was certainly traumatic, and so helping people through that as well has been part of that.
Okay, and last question: are you weapons trained?
So it's actually a great question. According to the Geneva Convention, no chaplains are allowed to carry firearms or weapons at all. So I am not officially trained with, at least through the military, with weapons training.
Right.
I'm actually not even.
Right? Those
Yes,
with horses, those with chariots, we with the name of God.
Absolutely. So, but again, it's an incredibly rewarding experience, and just so enjoyable, and just a great opportunity to really get out of my comfort zone in a lot of ways, and be able to provide some Jewish values and Jewish ideals to the general Canadian population. It's been a really amazing experience.
Well, Thank you. I thank you for sharing it, and thank you for making the time for us. Really appreciate it. Thank you to your commanding officer, who, if I understand, you need special permission to be able to wear the uniform in certain contexts. So really appreciate that. You educated me on that last year, and we had a really wonderful experience. And actually, in the same program, we also have that same doctor, Andrea Tuka, who's a psychiatrist in Canadian Forces. She was stationed here in Victoria, but now she's been able to move to Vancouver.
Oh, very nice.
So,
very nice. So yeah, no, it's always been a pleasure to talk to you, Rabbi Rosenblatt, and I certainly appreciate your interest and you taking the time. And I know the Canadian Armed Forces is always looking for opportunities to reach out to the community as well. So they were actually quite eager that I take part in this. So.
Oh, well, I'm glad. And if everything works really well, in my congregation is the very last surviving member of the Calgary Highlanders who liberated Holland. And they did a whole production with him on the 75th anniversary of the liberation. And I'm hoping that I'm going to get that footage. It airs on November 8th. So I'm hoping I'm going to be able to borrow that footage to be part of this compilation.
Oh, that sounds. I look forward to watching it. It sounds very interesting, actually.
Yeah. So, anyway, it's been a pleasure, and I should just say that I think my sensitivity to this whole subject came from one particular member of my congregation who unfortunately passed away a number of years ago, but he was a navigator on a Halifax bomber. I believe they were flying missions, on D-Day or just thereafter. And I just remember how important that was to him, how sort of elemental it was to who he was and what he had accomplished in his life. And so it reminds me how important this is. I mean, obviously its importance becomes more evident when you have to liberate Europe, and I hope that we don't have to do anything like that. But we're very proud to have you serving and representing us as well.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate that.
Okay, well, have a wonderful day.
You too. Thank you.
על כנפי השכינה במעלויס קדושים וטהורים כזוים ורקים הזהירים אסני ישמעס חיילי מערכי קנדה שלחו לעולמם בגני תמנו חסום לכן בלו רחמים יסתירם בסיסי כנופו ליועלמים ויצרוי בצרוי רחיים אס נשמוי סיים אדוני הוא נחלו וסום וינוחו בשלום על משכבו יסיים ונאמר אמן.
I just want to thank everyone for participating. I'm glad that really so many of you stayed on to the bitter end of this. Even in the middle, somebody sent me a photograph of their grandfather who was on the
in the Canadian forces at Passover Seder at the in England. I guess it was the Royal Canadian Air Force, or perhaps it was the Royal Air Force. I should also note that there are many, many members of this congregation and their children who served not just in the Canadian forces, but also there were those who served in the Royal Air Force and in a number of different British divisions, and so we should remember them as well. I thank you all for participating. I hope that you have enjoyed, and special thanks. I see Andrea Tuka is on this. Special thanks to Andrea and to Nancy Segal for helping me to get the archival material and doing some of Nancy Putterman for helping me get the archival material and the some of the background. Thank you to Ken Miller and to Joe Segal, of course, for spending some time with me and sharing with me this footage, and of course Rabbi Mordechai Rothman, who is stationed in Ontario, who also shared his time with us. So I wish you all a very good evening, and thank you for participating in tonight's event.
Thank you, Rabbi. Erev Tov.
Erev Tov.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi, וערב טוב לכולם.
Erev Tov l'kulam.
Lakulam, lakulam. Amen.